They called him a traitor before the sun even reached its highest point. But by the next morning, no one in that town could meet his eyes again. The wind moved slow across the main street, carrying dust that clung to boots and settled into the cracks of old wood like it had nowhere else to go, and beneath that pale sky, the rope swayed gently from the beam above the platform, not from force, not from use, just from the quiet weight of what was about to happen. And the townsfolk stood in a loose circle, hats pulled low, faces set in something harder than anger, something that didn't need to shout to be heard. She stood there with her hands bound, wrists marked from the tightness of the rope, her dark hair catching the light in uneven strands, her eyes steady in a way that didn't belong to someone surrounded by people who had already decided her fate. And if she felt fear, she didn't show it, not in her posture, not in her breath, not even in the way she looked out past them, as if she could already see beyond this moment, beyond this place, beyond them. Someone muttered a word under their breath, Apache, and it moved through the crowd like a quiet agreement, like a verdict already signed, and no one questioned it. Not the men leaning against the posts, not the women clutching their shawls tighter, not even the boy standing on a crate trying to see over the shoulders of men twice his size, because out here, being different was enough, and being Apache was more than enough. The sheriff stood off to the side, fingers brushing the edge of his belt, not gripping, not resting, just touching like he needed to remind himself it was there. His eyes shifting between the rope and the girl and the crowd, and every now and then, he'd open his mouth slightly like he might say something, but nothing ever came out, and that silence said more than any speech could have. Then came the sound that didn't belong. Not loud, not sudden, just steady. The slow rhythm of hooves pressing into dry earth, one after the other, measured, unhurried, and it didn't take long for heads to turn, for conversations to fade, for that invisible line of attention to shift toward the edge of town where the dust lifted just enough to reveal a single rider approaching without urgency and without fear. He didn't rush. He didn't reach for anything. He just rode straight down the center of that street like he had every right to be there, like he hadn't heard the whispers or felt the weight of a dozen eyes narrowing as he drew closer. And when he finally pulled the reins and stepped down from the saddle, the boards beneath his boots creaked once, sharp and clear, and in that moment, it felt louder than anything that had come before. Ethan Caldwell didn't look at the crowd first. He looked at her. Just once. Just long enough to see the truth that no one else seemed interested in finding. And then he turned his gaze to the rope, then to the sheriff, and only then did he speak, his voice low, even carrying just far enough without needing to rise. "What's the charge?" he asked, and the question hung there like something unfamiliar, like something that hadn't been part of the plan. A man near the front stepped forward, jaw tight, eyes hard. "She's Apache," he said, like that answered everything, like that was reason enough, and a few others nodded, not loudly, not proudly, just enough to keep the weight of the moment leaning in one direction. Ethan let the words sit for a second, not reacting, not arguing, just letting them exist, and then he moved, one step at a time toward the platform, not fast, not slow, just deliberate, each step measured like he understood exactly what it would cost him. "That's not a charge," he said quietly, more to the air than to the man. And when he reached the edge, he didn't ask permission, didn't look for approval. He simply stepped up, the wood shifting under his weight, and for a brief second, the entire town seemed to hold its breath, not because of what he might do, but because of what he had already decided. The girl watched him now, her eyes narrowing just slightly, not in fear, not in trust, but in something closer to recognition, like she understood the kind of man who would walk into a moment like this without raising his voice, without showing his hand, and when he reached for the rope binding her wrists, his fingers didn't rush, didn't fumble, they worked with quiet precision, loosening the knot like it had never belonged there in the first place. "You don't get to do that," someone called out, sharper this time, louder, the first crack in the crowd's stillness, and a few others shifted, boots scraping, hands moving just a little closer to belts and pockets, not drawing, not yet, but thinking about it. Ethan didn't look back. "Watch me," he said, not as a challenge, not as a threat, just as a fact, and when the rope fell away from her wrists, it landed on the wood with a soft, final sound that seemed to echo longer than it should have, like it carried more than just fibers and knots, like it carried the weight of a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The sheriff took a step forward, hesitated, then stopped again, and in that hesitation, something shifted in the air, something subtle but real, like the balance of the moment had tilted just enough to make everyone aware that this wasn't going the way it was supposed to. "You're making a mistake, Caldwell," the sheriff said, his voice quieter now, less certain, and Ethan finally turned, not fully, just enough to meet his eyes. "No," he replied, calm as ever. "I'm refusing to make one." And somewhere in that silence that followed, beneath the creak of wood and the whisper of wind, you could feel it. The moment a man chose not to stand with the crowd, but against it, and didn't reach for a gun, didn't raise his voice, just stood there, steady, unshaken, like the kind of justice that doesn't need to be loud to be heard. The rope lay still at his feet, and for a long second, no one moved, not because they could not, but because they did not know how, and that uncertainty spread quieter than fear, settling into the space between boots and breath until even the wind seemed to hesitate before crossing the street again. And Ethan could feel it without turning, that shift in the weight of the crowd, that moment when people begin to question what they thought they already understood. Nayeli did not step away right away, even with her hands free. She stayed where she was, shoulders straight, chin lifted just enough to show she was not asking for protection, only accepting what had been given. And when she finally moved, it was not toward the edge of the platform, but toward him. One slow step that carried more meaning than any word spoken in the last hour. Her voice low when it came, careful, steady. "You should not have done that." And it was not a warning, not exactly, more like a truth she had learned the hard way. Ethan glanced at her briefly, then back to the crowd. "Too late now," he said, simple, as if the decision had never been complicated to begin with, and maybe for him it had not been. A man near the saloon spat into the dust, shaking his head. "You are choosing her over your own people." And that word people lingered in the air like it belonged to someone else entirely, like it needed to be redefined before it could mean anything again. Ethan stepped down from the platform, boots landing with a dull thud against the earth, and every eye followed him, measuring, waiting, calculating what line had just been crossed and what it meant for them all. And when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not harden, it stayed exactly the same. "I am choosing what is right." And he did not look at anyone in particular when he said it, which somehow made it land heavier. The sheriff rubbed a hand across his jaw, glancing from Ethan to Nayeli and back again. "You take her out of here, Caldwell," he said. Not quite a command, not quite a plea. "And this town will not forget it." And the words were meant to carry weight, to draw a boundary, but there was something thin underneath them, something uncertain that had not been there before. Ethan nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, and turned slightly toward Nayeli. "Can you walk?" he asked, and she gave the smallest of nods in return, though her wrists still bore the marks of where the rope had been. And when they stepped forward together, it was not hurried, not hidden, just steady movement through a space that had suddenly become too quiet. The crowd parted without being asked, not out of respect, not out of kindness, but because something in the moment made it easier to step aside than to stand in the way. And as they passed, the eyes that followed were no longer certain, no longer fixed in that same hard judgment from before. Some still held it, yes, but others had begun to shift, just slightly, just enough to make the air feel different. A woman near the edge pulled her shawl tighter, whispering something under her breath that did not carry, and a young boy lowered himself from the crate, his gaze lingering on Nayeli's hands as if trying to understand what had changed, what had not. When they reached the far end of the street, where the buildings thinned and the open land began to stretch out beyond the last fence line, Ethan slowed just a fraction, not stopping, just adjusting his pace as if giving the moment room to settle, and only then did Nayeli speak again, quieter now. "They will come for me again." And this time, there was no uncertainty in her voice, only clarity. Ethan looked ahead, eyes narrowing slightly against the light. "Then they will have to come through me?" he replied, and there was no challenge in it, no bravado, just a statement laid down as plainly as the ground beneath their feet. She studied him for a second longer, something unreadable passing through her expression, before she turned her gaze forward again, matching his pace without another word, and behind them, the town remained still longer than it should have, longer than any normal moment would allow, as if it too was trying to understand what had just happened, and what it meant that a single man had stood there without raising his voice, without reaching for a weapon, and changed the direction of something that had felt inevitable only minutes before. And somewhere in that lingering silence, beneath the shifting dust and the fading echo of footsteps, The first cracks in certainty had begun to form, quiet, almost invisible, but real enough that by the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, nothing in that town would feel quite as simple as it had that morning. The road beyond the last fence line stretched out in a long ribbon of pale dust, the kind that clung to boots and followed you whether you wanted it to or not, and Ethan did not look back, not because he did not feel the weight of the town behind him, but because he had already stepped past the part where looking back changed anything, and beside him, Nayeli walked with a steadiness that did not match the marks still faintly visible on her wrists, her pace even, her breathing calm, as if she had already accepted whatever came next long before this day ever began. The sun had started its slow descent, casting a softer light across the plains, turning the edges of things gold and making shadows stretch longer than they should, and for a while, neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, just present, like something that needed to exist before anything honest could take its place. After a mile, maybe a little more, the shape of Ethan's cabin came into view, small against the open land, weathered wood, a narrow porch, a hitching post worn smooth by years of use, and nothing else for at least half a mile in any direction, the kind of place a man chose when he did not want to be found unless someone truly meant to find him. He slowed as they approached, reaching up to take the reins from his horse and tying it loosely, giving the animal enough slack to rest but not wander. His movements automatic, practiced, and when he turned back toward the cabin door, he paused just a second, as if measuring something unseen before pushing it open. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of wood and leather, of time spent alone, and the light filtered in through a single window, cutting a narrow line across the floorboards that creaked softly under their steps. Nayeli remained near the doorway at first, her eyes moving slowly across the space, taking in the small table, the iron stove, the neatly stacked supplies, everything in its place, everything quiet, and there was something in the way she observed it all that felt less like curiosity and more like understanding, like she recognized the kind of life that had been lived here without needing it explained. Ethan set a canteen on the table, filling a tin cup and offering it without a word, and she accepted it with a slight nod, her fingers brushing the rim before she drank, careful, deliberate, and when she lowered it again, she did not thank him, not because she was ungrateful, but because whatever existed between them had not yet found a place for that kind of word. "You should not stay here," she said after a moment, her voice quiet but certain, and Ethan leaned back slightly against the edge of the table, arms loose at his sides. "This is the only place I have," he replied, and it was not defensive, just a statement, as simple as anything else he had said that day. She studied him then, more directly this time, her gaze steady, searching for something deeper than his words. "They will not let this go?" she continued. "Not the sheriff, not the others?" And outside, the wind shifted just enough to press softly against the walls, as if the land itself was listening. Ethan reached up, removing the small metal badge from his vest, the one that had marked him as part of something larger than himself, and he set it down on the table with a quiet, deliberate motion. The sound it made against the wood soft but final, and for a second, his hand lingered there, not gripping, not pulling away, just resting, like he was acknowledging the weight of what had been left behind. "They already have not," he said, and when he looked at her again, there was no hesitation in his eyes, no doubt, just a kind of calm that came from having already accepted the cost. Nayeli's gaze dropped briefly to the badge, then back to his face, and something shifted there, not quite trust, not yet, but something close enough to stand beside it, and she stepped further into the room, closing the distance between them by a single pace that felt larger than it was. "Why?" she asked, not accusing, not confused, just needing to understand, and for the first time since he had walked into that town, Ethan did not answer right away. He moved instead toward the window, looking out across the open land where the horizon stretched wide and empty, and when he spoke, his voice carried something quieter, something older than the moment itself. "Because I have seen what happens when no one does," he said, and the words settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had come before, not because they were loud, but because they were true, in a way that did not need to be explained. Nayeli watched him in silence, her expression unreadable, but her posture no longer held that same distance it had at the door, and outside, far beyond the reach of the cabin. A faint line of dust began to rise along the edge of the horizon, too far to hear, too far to make out clearly, but they're all the same, moving slowly, steadily, like something that had already chosen its path and was not turning back. The line of dust on the horizon did not move fast, but it did not fade either, and that was what made it harder to ignore, the way it held its shape against the soft light of late afternoon, steady and deliberate, like something with purpose rather than chance, and Ethan saw it before Naeli spoke. His eyes narrowing just slightly as he leaned a fraction closer to the window, not tense, not hurried, just attentive in the way a man becomes when he recognizes a pattern he has seen before. Naeli stepped beside him, her presence quiet but certain, and when her gaze followed his out across the open land, there was no surprise in her expression, only recognition, the kind that comes from knowing what a distant movement means long before it reaches you. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, because the truth of it did not need to be spoken out loud. "How long?" Ethan asked finally, his voice low, and she measured the distance with a glance, the angle of the sun, the steadiness of the movement. "Before nightfall," she answered, and the words settled into the room like a clock that had just started ticking. Ethan pushed away from the window, not abruptly, just enough to begin moving through the cabin with quiet efficiency, checking what little he had without making it look like preparation for anything more than an ordinary evening. His hand brushing the edge of the table where the badge still rested, untouched, and for a second, he paused again, not to pick it up, but to acknowledge it once more before turning away. He moved to the shelf near the stove, taking down a folded cloth and setting it beside a small tin box, then another glance toward the window, measuring, calculating, not the distance of the riders, but the space inside his own walls, the kind of space that could either hold or break depending on what was brought into it. Naeli watched him without interrupting, her eyes following each movement, and there was something in the way she stood now that had changed, not relaxed, not at ease, but grounded, like she had shifted from being the one pursued to the one who understood the ground beneath her feet again. "They are not coming for you," she said after a moment, her voice carrying that same calm certainty as before, and Ethan gave a faint shake of his head. "They are coming to take you?" he replied, and there was no accusation in it, no blame, just an understanding of how the world tended to move when fear had already taken hold. She stepped closer to the table, her gaze dropping briefly to the badge, then lifting again to meet his. "If I leave, they will follow," she said, and it was not a suggestion, not a question, just a statement of fact, and the room seemed to grow smaller around it, the walls holding that truth in place. Ethan rested his hands on the edge of the table, fingers spread slightly against the worn wood, and for a second, he looked down, not avoiding her, just letting the weight of the choice settle into something solid, something that could be carried without shifting. "Then you stay," he said, and the words came as simply as everything else he had chosen that day, without hesitation, without embellishment. And when he looked up again, there was nothing in his expression that suggested he would say anything different tomorrow. Naeli studied him longer this time, her gaze searching for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that this was something he might reconsider when the dust came closer, but she did not find it, and that absence spoke louder than anything he could have explained. Outside, the wind picked up just enough to brush against the side of the cabin, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant earth, and the light shifted again, shadows stretching further across the ground as the sun dipped lower, marking the passage of time in a way that could not be ignored. Ethan moved toward the door, opening it slowly and, stepping out onto the porch, his boots settling against the wood with that same steady weight, and he looked out across the land again, the line of dust clearer now, more defined, no longer just a suggestion but a presence, and he did not reach for anything, did not call out, did not prepare in any way that would turn the moment into something louder than it already was. Naeli followed him to the doorway but did not step fully outside, her silhouette framed by the dim interior behind her, and for a brief second, the two of them stood in that space between inside and out, between what had already happened and what was still coming, and the distance between them and the approaching riders felt both wide and closing at the same time. "You could still walk away," she said quietly, not urging, not testing, just offering the truth one last time, and Ethan kept his gaze fixed on the horizon, the faintest hint of a breath leaving him before he answered, "I already did." And the words hung there, simple, final, as the light continued to fade and the dust line drew just a little closer, carrying with it the kind of silence that does not break when it arrives, but settles, waiting to see who will. The dust did not rush the land, it settled into it, slow and certain, and as the sun dipped lower, The shapes within it began to take form. Not clear yet, not close enough for faces or details, but enough to count. Enough to understand that this was no lone rider passing through. This was intention moving across open ground, and Ethan stood on the porch with his hands resting loosely at his sides, not reaching, not preparing, just watching in the same quiet way he had watched everything else. That day. Behind him, the cabin door creaked slightly as Naeli stepped fully outside, the fading light catching the edges of her hair, her posture straight, her gaze fixed on the same horizon, and there was no panic in her, no urgency, only a stillness that matched his, as if both of them understood that whatever came next would not be decided by movement, but by what remained unmoved. The wind carried a faint sound now, not loud, not sharp, just the distant rhythm of hooves pressing into earth, steady and unbroken, and it filled the silence between them without disturbing it. Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the wood beneath his boots giving a soft, familiar sound, and he glanced once toward the hitching post where his horse stood calm, ears flicking toward the distant approach but not pulling away, not restless, just aware, and that quiet awareness seemed to echo in everything around them. "They come in numbers," Naeli said, her voice low, not as a warning, but as a fact laid gently into the space, and Ethan nodded once, eyes still forward. "Numbers do not make them right," he replied, and the words did not challenge, did not provoke, they simply existed, steady as the ground beneath them. The line of riders grew clearer with each passing minute, shapes separating from dust, shadows stretching longer behind them, and though the distance still held, the intention no longer did. It was close enough now to feel, to measure, to stand against. Naeli took one step forward onto the porch, coming to stand beside him rather than behind, and that single movement shifted something subtle but real, not in the land, not in the approaching figures, but in the meaning of what this place had become. Ethan noticed it without turning, the slight change in presence, the quiet decision she had made to stand with him instead of being shielded by him, and he said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The last light of the day stretched thin across the plains, painting everything in a soft amber that made even tension look calm, and for a brief moment, the world seemed suspended between what had already been done and what had yet to arrive. Then, faint but unmistakable, the first figure at the front of the approaching line slowed, just slightly, enough to signal to the others, enough to shape what would come next, and the distance between two sides of the same land closed without a single word spoken. Ethan exhaled slowly, not from fear, not from doubt, but from the understanding that this moment had been moving toward him since the second he cut that rope, and as the riders drew near enough for their outlines to hold against the fading light, he remained. Exactly where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just standing in that narrow space between a man's choice and the world that answers it, and beside him, Naeli stood just as still, her presence no longer that of someone being taken or protected, but of someone who had returned to a place where standing meant something, and the wind moved once more across the open land, carrying with it the last quiet before anything would need to speak. The riders came to a stop just beyond the edge of the property, close enough now that the dust settled around them instead of hiding them, and in the fading light their shapes stood clear against the open land, not scattered, not disorganized, but held in a quiet formation that spoke of purpose without needing to show force, and at the front, one figure sat still on horseback, shoulders straight, posture calm, as if the distance between them and the cabin was not something to cross, but something already understood. Ethan did not step down from the porch, did not move toward them, and he did not call out, because whatever needed to be said would not begin with raised voices, and beside him, Naeli remained just as steady, her gaze fixed on the figure at the front, not searching, not questioning, but recognizing, and there was something in the way her shoulders settled that had not been there before, something that looked less like tension and more like arrival. The wind moved softly between them, carrying no words, only the faint rustle of dry grass and the distant creak of saddle leather, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, no one spoke, not the riders, not Ethan, not Naeli, and in that silence, something shifted that no one in the town would have understood, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with truth standing in plain sight. Then, slowly, the figure at the front dismounted, boots touching the ground with deliberate care, and as he stepped forward a single pace, the others behind him did not follow. They remained where they were, still, watchful, not advancing, not retreating, and that choice carried more weight than any movement forward could have. Ethan's. Eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, and he remained where he was, hands open, posture unchanged. And when the man spoke, his voice did not rise. It carried just enough to reach the porch without breaking the stillness that held the space together. "You stand with her?" the man said, not asking, not accusing, just stating what was already visible. And Ethan gave a small nod, nothing more, because there was no need to dress it in anything else. The man's gaze shifted then, moving past Ethan to Nayeli, and something in his expression softened, not in weakness, not in relief, but in recognition. The kind that comes from seeing someone who belongs to a place far older than any boundary drawn by men. And without another word, he lowered his head, just slightly, just enough to make the gesture clear, and behind him, one by one, the riders did the same, not rushed, not forced, but in a quiet, unified motion that carried meaning far beyond what the eyes alone could see. Ethan did not move, but something in his expression changed, not surprise, not confusion, but understanding, the kind that settles slowly into a man when the truth arrives without needing to be explained. And he glanced once toward Nayeli, just enough to see her standing taller now, not as someone being protected, not as someone being taken, but as someone being returned to her place in a way that no rope, no crowd, no accusation could ever erase. The man at the front lifted his head again and took one more step forward, stopping at the edge of the property line, respecting a boundary that had never been spoken but was clearly understood. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something deeper now, something rooted in respect rather than conflict. "She is not yours to defend," he said, and the words might have sounded like a challenge in another place, at another time, but here, in this moment, they held no threat, only truth, and Ethan's response came just as steady, just as quiet. "She never was," he said, and the wind carried those words across the space between them, settling into the land like something that had always been there, waiting to be spoken, and for a moment longer, everything remained still, the riders, the man, the cabin, the fading light, until the silence itself seemed to breathe, and what had come across miles of open ground did not arrive as a confrontation, but as something else entirely, something that no one in that town had expected, and no one would have believed if they had not seen it with their own eyes. The words settled between them without resistance, without echo, as if the land itself had been waiting to hear them spoken aloud, and for a moment, no one moved, not the riders, not Ethan, not even the wind that had carried so much silence across the open ground. And then Nayeli stepped forward, just one step, enough to shift her place from beside Ethan to slightly ahead of him, not leaving him behind, not stepping away, but standing where she no longer needed to be shielded, and the man at the front of the riders watched her with an expression that held no doubt, only recognition, the kind that does not need proof. "You came far," Nayeli said, her voice steady, carrying across the distance without force, and the man inclined his head slightly. "Far enough," he replied, and there was something in the way he spoke that suggested distance was not measured in miles, but in time, in patience, in the quiet understanding of what had been risked and what had been preserved. Ethan remained still behind her, not retreating, not stepping forward again, his presence unchanged, but the space between them had shifted, no longer defined by protection, but by something closer to respect, something earned without being asked for. The riders behind the man remained silent, their posture unchanged, and yet the air between them all felt different now, less like a line drawn between two sides and more like a boundary being acknowledged rather than challenged. Nayeli turned her head slightly, just enough to glance back at Ethan, not fully, not breaking her stance, and there was something in that look, brief as it was, that carried more weight than any spoken thanks, something quiet and certain that passed between them without needing a name. Ethan met her gaze for that second, then gave the smallest nod, not granting permission, not asking anything in return, just recognizing the moment for what it was. When she faced forward again, the man had taken another step closer, stopping just short of the porch, respecting the space as if it were marked by something unseen, and he spoke again, his voice calm. "You were not meant to stand alone," he said, and the words did not carry judgment, only truth, and Nayeli's response came without hesitation. "I was not alone," she said, and though her eyes remained on him, the meaning of her words reached behind her just as clearly. The man's gaze shifted briefly toward Ethan, studying him not as an enemy, not as an obstacle, but as something else entirely, something that did not fit into the simple lines that men often drew between themselves, and after a moment, he gave a slight nod of his own, a gesture small in motion but large in meaning. "Then the story will be told correctly," he said, and behind him, the riders shifted just enough to break their stillness, not advancing, not withdrawing, but preparing for something that did not require urgency. The last light of the day stretched across the land, casting long shadows that blurred the distance between them all, and Ethan finally stepped forward again, not to take back the space Naeli had claimed, but to stand beside it, equal in that moment, his voice quiet when he spoke. "No one needed to come here tonight," he said, and it was not a complaint, not a warning, just a simple truth laid out plainly. The man looked at him, then back to Naeli, and there was a faint shift in his expression, something that might have been approval or understanding or both. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "people must see what they refuse to believe." And his words seemed to carry beyond the porch, beyond the riders, as if they were meant for more than just those standing there. Naeli's posture softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in release, as if something that had been held tight for too long had finally been set down, and the tension that had followed her from the town, from the rope, from the eyes of those who had judged her without knowing her, began to fade into the open air. The wind moved again, gentle now, carrying the scent of the land and the quiet understanding that had settled into it, and for a moment longer no one spoke, because nothing more needed to be said, not here, not now, and what had arrived from the horizon had not come to take, or to fight, or to demand, but to witness, to stand, and to leave behind something that would not be easily forgotten by any who had seen it unfold. The quiet did not break when the last word faded, it deepened, settling into the space between breath and thought, and for the first time since the riders had appeared on the horizon, the land felt still in a different way, not waiting, not bracing, but holding something that had already resolved itself without force. The man at the front turned slightly, not away, but enough to signal to those behind him, and though no command was spoken, the riders shifted in quiet understanding, their horses adjusting, their posture easing, not retreating in haste, not lingering in tension, but preparing to leave as if their purpose had already been fulfilled the moment they arrived. Naeli watched them with steady eyes, her shoulders no longer carrying the same weight they had when she stood on that platform in town, and as the riders began to turn, one by one, the soft sound of hooves pressing into the earth replaced the earlier stillness, not as an interruption, but as a continuation, like a story moving forward without needing to repeat itself. Ethan remained where he was, his stance unchanged, but his gaze followed the movement with quiet attention, not suspicion, not relief, just understanding. And when the last of the riders began to turn, the man at the front paused once more, glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes meeting Naeli's for a brief moment that carried something final, something unspoken but complete, and then he nodded once, a gesture small and certain, before stepping back toward his horse and mounting without haste. The sky had shifted fully into evening now, the last of the sun slipping beneath the horizon, leaving behind a soft glow that stretched across the plains, and as the riders began to move away, the dust rose again, but this time it did not feel heavy, did not carry tension. It lifted lightly, almost gently, as if even the land understood that nothing needed to be proven here. Naeli exhaled slowly, a breath she had not realized she had been holding, and for a moment she stood there without moving, her gaze lingering on the fading shapes in the distance until they became part of the horizon once more. And only then did she turn slightly toward Ethan, not fully, just enough to acknowledge his presence beside her. He did not speak right away, and neither did she, because the moment did not ask for words, it asked for something quieter, something that could settle without being named, and after a few seconds, Ethan glanced toward the cabin, then back to her. "They will not return tonight," he said, not as a question, but as a recognition of what had just passed. Naeli gave a small nod, her voice softer now, carrying none of the earlier tension. "No," she said, and there was certainty in it. Not hope, not assumption, but knowledge shaped by something deeper than distance. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the faint scent of cooling earth and the quiet aftermath of something that had not become what it could have been, and Ethan stepped down from the porch slowly, his boots pressing into the ground with that same steady weight, as if marking the end of something that had never needed to begin. He walked a few paces forward, stopping just short of where the riders had stood. His gaze drifting across the land where their tracks remained, faint lines pressed into the soil, already beginning to soften under the evening air, and behind him, Naeli followed at a distance of a few steps, not closing it, not widening it, just keeping it as it was, balanced in a way that did not require adjustment. "You knew they would not come for me?" Ethan said after a moment, his voice quiet, and Naeli stepped closer, her gaze moving to the same fading tracks. "I knew they would come to see," she replied, and her words carried a weight that reached beyond the riders, beyond the town, beyond even the moment itself. Ethan considered that, his eyes lingering on the horizon where the last trace of dust had disappeared, and he gave a slight nod, not fully understanding, not needing to, just accepting the truth as it had revealed itself. The light continued to fade, the first hints of night settling into the edges of the land, and the cabin behind them stood unchanged, the same as it had been that morning, yet something within it, around it, between the two people standing before it, had shifted in a way that could not be undone, and in that quiet, as the world moved gently into darkness, the absence of conflict spoke louder than anything that might have been said, leaving behind a silence that did not feel empty, but complete. The night settled gently over the land, not sudden, not heavy, but steady, like a blanket drawn without hurry, and the last trace of the riders had already dissolved into the horizon, leaving behind only faint impressions in the soil that would not last until morning, and Ethan stood there a moment longer than necessary, his eyes tracing those fading lines as if committing something unseen to memory, not the riders themselves, but what their presence had meant, what their absence now confirmed. Behind him, the cabin waited in silence, its wooden frame catching the first touch of cool air, and Naeli stood just a few feet away, her posture no longer guarded, her breathing even, as if the weight she had carried since the town had finally found a place to rest. Neither of them spoke at first, because there was nothing left that needed to be proven, and sometimes silence carried more truth than words ever could. Ethan turned back slowly, his boots pressing softly into the dirt as he stepped toward the porch, and for a moment, his gaze fell on the doorway, the narrow opening that had held both distance and refuge within the same frame, and then he stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him without thought, without hesitation. Naeli followed after a short pause, her steps quieter, but certain, and when she crossed the threshold, the space between them shifted again, not smaller, not larger, just clearer, as if the lines that once separated them had been redrawn into something that did not divide, but connected. Inside, the dim light of evening rested against the wooden walls, and Ethan moved toward the table, his hand brushing against the edge where the badge still lay, untouched since he had placed it there, and this time, he picked it up, not quickly, not reluctantly, just with the same steady intention he had shown all day. He turned it once in his fingers, the metal catching what little light remained, and for a second, his expression held something distant, something tied to a life that no longer fit the shape of the man standing there. Naeli watched him without speaking, her gaze steady, not questioning, not pressing, just present, and when he set the badge down again, it was not in the same place, not in the same way, it rested closer to the edge now, as if it had already begun to move out of his life, even before he did. "You gave up more than a place in that town," she said quietly, her voice carrying no judgment, only observation, and Ethan leaned back slightly against the table, his eyes meeting hers without hesitation. "I gave up something that stopped meaning what it was supposed to," he replied, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not need to be explained further. Naeli considered that, her gaze lowering briefly before lifting again, and there was something softer there now, something that had not been present before, not quite trust, not yet, but something that had begun to take root in its place. Outside, the wind moved again, brushing gently against the cabin walls, and the quiet of the night deepened, wrapping around the two of them in a way that felt less like isolation and more like space. Space to think, to understand, to let what had happened settle into something lasting. Ethan reached for the canteen again, pouring another cup of water and setting it on the table without offering it directly this time, just leaving it there, and Naeli stepped forward to take it, her movements calm, unhurried, as if the urgency that had once driven every step she took had finally eased into something steadier. "Tomorrow," she said after a moment, her voice low, "they will speak of what happened." And Ethan gave a faint nod, his gaze drifting briefly toward the open door, where the night stretched wide and quiet beyond the porch. "They already are," he said, and there was no concern in his voice, no resistance, just acceptance, because whatever story the town chose to tell, it would not change what had been done, what had been chosen, what had been proven without a single shot fired or a single threat made. Naeli watched him for a moment longer, and then she gave a small nod of her own, as if acknowledging something she had not expected to find. Not in him. Not in this place. And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, no longer waiting. It was settled, grounded, and as the night deepened around them, the world outside continued as it always had, but inside that small cabin, something had shifted in a way that would not fade with the morning light. Morning did not arrive with noise, it came slowly, as it always did, light slipping over the edge of the land and stretching across the plains in quiet layers, touching the cabin first, then the fence posts, then the long, empty distance beyond, and when Ethan stepped out onto the porch, the air carried that cool stillness that only exists before the day fully wakes, clean, open, untouched by whatever words might follow. He stood there for a moment, hands resting loosely at his sides, his gaze moving across the horizon not in search of anything, but in recognition of what had already passed, and for the first time since the day before, there was nothing moving out there, no dust, no riders, just the land itself, wide and indifferent, yet somehow different all the same. Behind him, the cabin door opened softly, and Naeli stepped out, her movements quiet, her presence steady, and she paused beside him without speaking, her eyes following the same line across the distance, and for a moment, the two of them stood in that shared silence again. But this time it held something lighter, something settled. "They will come," she said after a while, her voice low, not tense, not uncertain, just aware, and Ethan gave a small nod, not turning to her. "Not like before," he replied, and there was a quiet certainty in it, the kind that does not argue, does not need to prove itself. The wind shifted gently, carrying with it a faint sound from far off. Not hooves this time, not many, just a single rhythm, steady and unhurried, and both of them heard it at the same moment, their attention moving toward the distant road where a lone figure began to take shape against the morning light. The rider approached without hesitation, without urgency, and as he drew closer, the details became clearer, the outline of a familiar hat, the straight posture, the measured pace, and Ethan recognized him before the man even reached the edge of the property. The sheriff pulled his horse to a stop several yards from the porch, not crossing the invisible line that had been respected the night before, and for a moment, he remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the reins, his eyes moving between Ethan and Naeli, as if measuring something that had shifted beyond his understanding. He dismounted slowly, boots touching the ground with a soft thud, and took a few steps forward, stopping short of the porch, his gaze steady, but no longer carrying the same certainty it had in the town square. "Word travels fast," he said, his voice quieter than it had been the day before, and Ethan gave a faint nod. "It always does," he replied, and there was no edge in his tone, no resistance, just acknowledgement. The sheriff glanced toward Naeli, then back to Ethan, and for a second, it looked like he might say something else, something heavier, something closer to what had been left unsaid in the town. But instead, he let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing just slightly. "They saw," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, not of accusation, not of judgment, but of realization, and Ethan understood without needing more. "And now?" Ethan asked, not pressing, not demanding, just opening the space for whatever answer might come, and the sheriff looked out across the land, the same horizon that had held so much tension the day before, now empty, now quiet, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, just enough to be noticed. "Now they are not so sure anymore," he said, and there was something in that uncertainty that felt more honest than any certainty that had come before it. Naeli remained still beside Ethan, her presence calm, her gaze steady, and the sheriff looked at her once more, not with suspicion this time, not with fear, but with something closer to understanding, though it had not yet fully taken shape. He gave a small nod, not formal, not official, just human, and turned back toward his horse, his movements slower than when he had arrived, as if the weight he carried now was not authority, but something else entirely. Ethan watched him go without speaking, his expression unchanged, and as the sheriff rode away, the sound of hooves faded into the distance just as quietly as it had come, leaving behind the same open land, the same morning light, but not the same meaning. Naeli turned slightly toward Ethan, her voice soft. "They begin to see," she said, and Ethan looked out across the horizon once more, the faintest hint of a nod following her words. "Sometimes that is enough," he replied, and the wind moved again across the plains, carrying with it not the weight of what had been done, but the quiet shift of what had been understood. The sound of the sheriff's horse faded into the distance until it became part of the morning itself, indistinguishable from the wind moving across the plains, and for a long moment after he was gone, neither Ethan nor Naeli moved, not because there was nothing to do, but because the stillness that followed felt like something worth holding on to just a little longer. The light had risen higher now, casting clearer lines across the land, revealing details that the night had softened, the worn edges of the porch, the faint tracks left by hooves that were already beginning to blur, and beyond it all, the same wide horizon that had witnessed everything without ever changing its shape. Ethan stepped down from the porch slowly, his boots pressing into the earth with that same quiet weight, and he moved toward the hitching post, his hand brushing lightly along the rope as if grounding himself in something simple, something familiar, and the horse shifted slightly, calm, steady, as it had been through it all. Naeli remained on the porch at first, watching him, her gaze thoughtful, not distant, but turned inward in a way that suggested she was measuring something not easily seen, something that did not belong to this place alone. After a moment, she stepped down as well, her feet finding the ground with quiet certainty, and she walked a few paces out into the open, her eyes lifting toward the hills far beyond the plains, where the land rose in soft lines against the sky. "My people will expect me to return," she said, her voice carrying across the short distance between them. Not heavy, not urgent, just clear, and Ethan turned slightly toward her, his expression unchanged, but his attention fully present. "Then you should," he replied, and there was no hesitation in it, no attempt to hold her here, no suggestion that this place was meant to be anything more than it was. A moment, a crossing, not a destination. Naeli studied him for a second, her gaze steady, searching for something that might contradict his words, something that might reveal a different truth beneath them. But she did not find it, and that absence spoke as clearly as anything he could have said. "You do not ask me to stay," she said quietly, not accusing, not surprised, just acknowledging what was there. And Ethan gave a slight shake of his head, his eyes moving briefly toward the horizon before returning to her. "I do not ask for what is not mine to keep," he answered, and the words settled between them with the same calm certainty that had carried him through everything before. Naeli's posture shifted just slightly, not away, not closer, but into something more grounded, as if his answer had confirmed something she had already begun to understand, and she nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried weight. The wind moved again, brushing through the dry grass, carrying with it the quiet sounds of the land waking fully into the day, and for a moment, the world felt larger than the space between them, larger than the choices that had brought them here. Ethan turned back toward the cabin, taking a few steps before pausing at the doorway, his hand resting briefly against the frame, and when he spoke again, his voice was as steady as it had been from the beginning. "There is food inside," he said, not as an offer that needed to be accepted, but as something simply placed there, available without condition. Naeli looked at him, then at the cabin, then back to the horizon, and for a brief second, it seemed as though she stood between two directions, two paths that did not oppose each other, but did not merge either, and then she stepped forward, closing the small distance between them, not entering the cabin, not turning away, just standing there, present. "I will leave when the sun is high," she said, her voice soft, and Ethan gave a small nod, accepting the time without question, without comment, and the moment settled once more into quiet understanding. The land stretched around them, unchanged yet different, and as the morning continued to unfold, there was no sense of urgency, no pressure to speak, only the steady passing of time, and the knowledge that some crossings are not meant to last, but they leave something behind all the same, something that does not fade when the road continues, something that remains in the way a man stands, in the way a woman walks away, and in the silence that follows when both understand exactly why. The sun climbed higher without hurry, pulling the shadows in close and laying a clear, steady light across the land, and with it came the quiet understanding that time does not pause for anything, not for choices, not for moments that feel like they should last longer than they do, and Ethan moved through the morning with the same calm rhythm as always, tending to the small tasks that kept the place standing, checking the water, adjusting the tack. His movements simple, grounded, as if nothing had changed, though everything had. Naeli remained near the edge of the porch for a while, watching the way he moved, the way he did not look over his shoulder to see if she was still there, the way he did not fill the silence with questions or words, and there was something in that absence that felt more respectful than any gesture she had known before, something that allowed her to stand in her own space without being pulled into another. The sky stretched wide and clear above them, and the distant hills held their shape against it, unchanged, waiting, and as the light reached its highest point, Naeli stepped down from the porch once more, her path leading not toward the cabin, not toward the open land behind it, but toward the narrow trail that cut across the plains and led back to where she had come from. She did not rush, did not hesitate, her steps steady, each one carrying the quiet weight of a decision already made, and when she reached the edge of the yard, she paused, just for a second, not turning fully, not stepping back, just allowing the moment to exist before it passed. Ethan had already seen her move, though he did not follow and he did not call out, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he stood a few yards from the porch, his gaze fixed on her not with expectation, not with resistance, but with the same quiet presence he had offered from the beginning. Naeli turned her head slightly then, enough to meet his eyes across the short distance, and there was something in that look that carried everything that had been left unsaid, something steady, something certain, and she gave a small nod, not as a farewell, not as a promise, but as acknowledgement, as recognition of what had been shared and what would remain unspoken. Ethan returned the nod just as simply, not adding to it, not diminishing it, and in that exchange, brief as it was, there was no need for more. The wind moved softly across the land, lifting the edges of her clothing, brushing against the dry grass, carrying with it the faint scent of distance, and Naeli turned forward again, stepping onto the trail without looking back, her figure moving slowly at first, then settling into a steady pace that matched the rhythm of the land itself. Ethan remained where he was, watching until the space between them grew wider, until her form became smaller against the open plains, until the distance turned her into part of the horizon once more, and only then did he shift his stance, his gaze lowering slightly as if marking the end of something that did not need to be held onto to be understood. The cabin stood behind him, unchanged, its door still open, the table still, holding the small metal badge that no longer carried the same meaning it once had. And as the sun continued its path across the sky, the world moved forward without pause, just as it always did. But something remained, not in the ground, not in the air, but in the quiet way a man stands after choosing what is right, and in the steady way a woman walks away without needing to be asked to stay, and though no one else was there to see it now, no crowd, no riders, no sheriff, the truth of what had happened did not need witnesses anymore. It had already taken its place in the only place that mattered. The land did not remember footsteps for long, and by the time the sun leaned westward again, the trail Naeli had taken was already fading into the same quiet dust that covered everything else, and Ethan stood near the fence line where he had last seen her, not searching for her shape, not expecting her return, just standing where the moment had ended, letting it settle into something that did not need to be held onto to remain real. The wind moved across the plains in long, steady breaths, bending the dry grass and carrying with it the same open silence that had always belonged to this place, and for the first time in a long while, that silence did not feel empty to him, it felt full, as if something had been placed within it that would not be taken away by time or distance. He turned slowly and walked back toward the cabin, his steps unhurried, the boards of the porch giving their familiar creak as he stepped up, and inside, nothing had changed, not the table, not the stove, not the light that fell through the narrow window, and yet the room did not feel the same, not after what had passed through it, not after what had been chosen within it. His eyes moved to the edge of the table where the badge still rested, catching the afternoon light in a dull, quiet way, and he stepped closer, picking it up once more, turning it between his fingers, feeling its weight not as a symbol now, but as something finished, something that had served its purpose and no longer needed to be carried. For a moment he stood there, the metal cool in his hand, and then he set it down again, not back where it had been, but closer to the center of the table, as if placing it where it could be seen clearly, not hidden, not claimed, just left as it was. Outside, the world continued in its steady rhythm. The sound of wind, the faint call of distant birds, the creak of wood, and Ethan stepped back out onto the porch, his gaze lifting toward the horizon once more. Not searching this time, not waiting, just looking. The way a man looks when he understands that what mattered has already happened. The town lay somewhere beyond that line, carrying its own stories now, its own versions of what had been seen, what had been believed, and what had been quietly changed, and Ethan did not wonder what they would say, because it did not belong to him anymore. Not the words, not the judgment, only the choice he had made when it mattered. He rested his hands lightly on the railing, the wood worn smooth beneath his fingers, and for a moment, the memory of the rope, the platform, the silence of the crowd flickered through his mind, not as something heavy, not as something that needed to be pushed away, but as something complete, something that had reached its end without needing to be forced there. The light shifted again, casting longer shadows across the ground, and in that quiet, there was no triumph, no sense of victory, only a calm that settled deep, the kind that comes when a man no longer measures himself by what others expect of him, but by what he knows to be right. Somewhere far beyond the hills, a figure walked her own path, steady and unbroken, and though the distance between them would grow with each passing hour, the space that had existed between them before had already changed, not closed, not erased, but understood in a way that did not require closeness to remain true. The wind passed once more, lifting dust into the air and carrying it across the open land, and Ethan remained where he was, not moving, not speaking, just standing in the quiet that followed everything. And out here, where the world did not rush to explain itself, that was enough, because sometimes justice does not need to be declared, it does not need to be seen by many. It only needs a man who refuses to step aside, and the silence that remains when it is done speaks louder than anything else ever could.